The sack on her head wasn't just burlap. It was silent shame, and something else no one dared name. They called it an auction, but there were no bidders, just men too cruel to look and women too tired to run. And in the back, standing half in shadow, was a man named Thorn, a lumberjack with too much winter behind him and not enough words left to waste. He hadn't come to buy a bride. He hadn't come to save anyone. But when the girl with the sack was shoved forward, small, quiet, trembling beneath that rough cloth, he stepped forward and laid down $2 silver. No one laughed. No one stopped him. They just watched. When they asked for her name, she didn't speak. When they asked where she was from, she didn't move. But later, in a cabin where the fire had nearly gone out, she sat across from him and whispered something so soft the pine walls had to lean in to hear it. It wasn't just her name. It was a memory buried in Thorn's bones. A name from long ago, before grief made him forget how to hold on to anything gentle. So he did the only thing he knew how. He married her. Not with a preacher, not with a crowd, but with the offering of his own name and a promise that whatever she'd been through, she'd never be nameless again. But who was she really? Why did her name stop him cold? And what secret had followed her all the way into the mountains, waiting to tear the roof off their fragile peace? Stay with us. Because not every Western story is about guns and gold. Some are about men who've lost too much and the women who help them remember what still matters. The auction started late that day. Dust hung low in the air, like breath held too long. Horses stomped impatiently beyond the fence, and a few children tugged on their mothers' skirts, whispering things they didn't fully understand. Thorn Callahan, the lumberjack with one working shoulder and a reputation for silence, stood at the edge of the crowd. He didn't intend to buy anything. He'd come to deliver a cartload of firewood to the blacksmith and ride back to his cabin before nightfall. But then the sheriff cleared his throat and the crowd turned toward the platform. A woman was led up, head bowed, hands bound in front of her with cotton rope. A rough burlap sack covered her face. Her clothes were plain brown with soot and the smell of smoke. No name was called. No crime read aloud. The sheriff only said, "One more mouth this town won't feed." They started the bidding at $5. No one spoke. Thorn didn't move, but he stared. The wind picked up, lifting one edge of the sack. A strand of hair slipped free, black streaked with gray. Not young, not old either. Just worn thin like barnwood in the rain. $2, Thorn said. No one countered. A few men laughed, called him names, paid less for that mule of his. But he stepped forward, laid 2 silver coins in the sheriff's palm, and untied the rope with steady hands. Still, he did not remove the sack. He led her to his horse. She said nothing. He offered no words either. Only his coat. The ride home was long and silent, except for the creak of saddle leather and the wind chasing them through dry trees. At the cabin, he helped her down. She stood on the steps for a moment, like someone deciding whether to run. "You're safe," he said finally. She reached up slowly and pulled the sack off her head. Her eyes met his, and something shifted in Thorn's chest. She spoke just one word, a name. His face went pale. It was the name of a woman he had buried 10 years ago. What kind of woman returns from the dead wearing sackcloth, and what secret does she carry in her silence? Thorn didn't sleep that first night. He sat by the fire long after she'd gone to the back room, if you could call it that, just a curtain strung across 2 beams and a thin cot behind. She hadn't said another word since whispering that name, the name he had carved into a wooden cross, the name he had folded up inside himself like a letter never sent. Marybelle. But it couldn't be. The woman who had died from fever on the trail to Oregon wasn't this one? Or was she? The eyes were the same, black as coals, yet full of something soft like water, trying to remember how to shine. But her face had changed. Cheekbones sharper, mouth quieter. That woman used to sing to sparrows while she washed clothes in the stream. This one didn't hum. The next morning she rose before him, cooking with calm hands. Beans flatbread and water boiled clean. She moved like someone who had done it for others for too long. Everything in her said, "Don't look too close." But Thorn did. He watched the way she stood slightly off balance on one leg. The same limp, the same scar just below her ear, a knife wound from years ago when a drunken traveler mistook kindness for surrender. He didn't ask again. He simply laid out another chair beside the table, and when she set a tin cup in front of him, he nodded and she nodded back. A truce of the silent kind. At midday, he went to the woods to chop cedar and returned to find the cabin swept, the laundry done, and the sack she'd worn folded neatly by the hearth. He didn't touch it. She was waiting on the porch with a bundle of herbs. Found these by the stream, she said. First full sentence. Thorne looked at the herbs, then at her hands. Used to gather those, he said, when I had someone to boil them with. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. He didn't ask where she'd been. She didn't ask why he had stayed all these years alone. Some wounds didn't like light. But that evening, as dusk stretched across the ridges and coyotes called to one another like old regrets, she stood at the fence and whispered, "I didn't die. I was taken." And Thorne, standing behind her, just said, "I know." How do you begin again with someone who was stolen from you, then returned like a stranger? The snow held off that week, but the air bit sharper as if it remembered things men had tried to forget. Thorne moved through his days the way he always had, stacking wood, feeding hens, mending fences. But now every silence was doubled. Not lonelier, just fuller, like someone had finally sat across from him and didn't mind the quiet. Maribel took to the porch. She patched the torn curtain without being asked. She ground corn with the rhythm of memory in her arms. She never hummed, but she did breathe easier by the fire, and once Thorne caught her looking out the window with something like softness in her face. But the nights they held the struggle, neither could name. He slept with one ear to the wind, hearing her shift on the cot, sometimes whispering a name he didn't recognize. "Etta," she murmured once. Another night she called out, "No." I didn't like she was answering a question someone cruel had asked too many times. Thorne didn't push. He simply added another log to the stove, made sure her tea was steeped before she woke. On the fifth day, she found his carving knife. Not the tool itself, but the cedar figures beside the stove. Little animals smoothed down by worry and time. She turned one in her hand. A fox, tail curled, ears alert. "You made these?" she asked. He nodded. "Used to sell 'em. Folks in town thought they made good gifts." She ran her thumb over the grain. "It's good to make something that doesn't ask questions." That night after supper, she stayed longer at the table. "There was a girl," she said at last. "She cried for 3 days when they pulled me from her, but they said a wife can't keep a daughter when she's sold." Thorne didn't look up, but he reached over and slid the carved fox closer to her. "For her," he said. Her hand shook as she touched it, not with fear, with something deeper. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked. "Because no one else was," he said simply. Outside, wind rattled the eaves. Inside, two souls sat side by side, both trying to believe kindness wasn't a trick. What happens when two people too hurt to trust begin to reach for one another anyway? The thaw came early that year. Just a bit of dripping off the eaves, the whisper of mud beneath boot soles. But it was enough. Maribel took off her sack-stitched shawl that morning and folded it clean, placing it on the mantel like something she wouldn't be needing again. Her hair, long and iron dark, spilled freely, for the first time braided only at the tail. She didn't say a word about it, and Thorne didn't comment, though his hands went still as he wiped down the stove. That day she helped mend the chicken coop, not out of duty, but because she said, "The light's good and I don't want to sit alone." Later they sat on the porch with mugs of weak chicory, not speaking much. Maribel's eyes followed a hawk carving slow circles overhead. The wind was gentle. The world was quiet. "Do you know why I said my name that way?" she asked, suddenly not turning her head. Thorne glanced at her. "At the auction. When I told you, I whispered it like I was afraid the sound itself might get punished." He waited. "I haven't heard it in years. Not in a mouth that didn't spit it like a curse." She looked down at her hands. "But you said it like it belonged." Thorne set his cup down. "It does," he said. That evening she cooked something from memory rice with wild greens and salted lard. It filled the house with something more than scent, something remembered. They ate together without hurry. When night fell, she reached for the lamp wick, but her hand brushed his. Neither of them pulled away. No vows, no promises, but the quiet had changed. It no longer meant hiding, it meant peace. If you've been told you're worthless long enough, what happens the first time someone believes you're not? The sun still rose like it always had, but now it lingered longer on the porch rail, warming Maribel's bare hands as she ground coffee with the old mill. Her sack-stitched shawl hadn't returned to her shoulders, and she sang soft and uncertain in a language Thorne didn't know. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was something nearby. That week, Thorne took her into town. They didn't say why. She walked 3 paces behind him, not out of fear habit maybe, or protection. Eyes turned when they passed. Boots scuffed the dirt. Someone spat. One man muttered that the auction girl Maribel didn't flinch. But Thorne's hand curled into a quiet fist at his side. At the general store, she paused in front of a display of hairbrushes. Her fingers hovered over one made of horn and soft bristle. "You can pick it," Thorne said. "I never had one," she replied. Not that wasn't shared. Still, she didn't take it. That evening back at the cabin, she sat by the fire and said, "They know me here. Not my name. My old shame." Thorne looked over. "I was sold by someone who owed nothing but took everything anyway, and they made a show of it. Called me foreign, dirty, a burden." She didn't cry. She'd passed that long ago. "You don't need to tell me more," Thorne said, voice like embers. "But you can." She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she knelt near the hearth, hands busy with darning socks the way she had, long before anyone ever said her name like a curse. But he saw it the way her shoulders eased just slightly, as if saying it aloud even once had pulled some thorn from the deepest part of her. Some stories don't need fixing, just the space to be spoken without fear. The storm clouds that had gathered for days never fell. Instead, they hovered over the ridge like a held breath, as though the sky itself didn't want to interrupt whatever was shifting inside that little cabin in the pines. Thorne was mending the fence out back when he heard her voice rising in song. Not the humming she did in the morning. Not the tuneless lullabies she whispered to herself when boiling beans or scrubbing clothes. This was clearer, fuller, whole. He stopped hammering. Inside, Maribel stood by the table, sleeves rolled up, hair braided for the first time. She didn't see him in the doorway. She didn't need to. Her voice wasn't for an audience. It was for the silence, to see if it would finally sing back. That evening, they ate stew without saying much, but she reached for the bread first. And when the lantern flickered, she was the one to rise and relight it. Small things, but not nothing. Later, as he stacked firewood, he found her sitting near the stump where he chopped logs. The stars blinked low and steady above the clearing. "You know," she said, "there was a time I thought silence was safety." Thorne didn't speak. Just let her keep going. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was hiding, and hiding don't heal. He sat beside her, not close, but not far either. She reached into her coat and took out a folded paper creased and yellowed, a contract with her name still printed at the bottom. She tore it slow and sure, then let the pieces fall into the fire. They didn't say what it meant, but both stayed until only ashes remained. When the storm doesn't break, it might be because what needed to fall already has. Spring didn't arrive with a fanfare. It came like most things in the mountains, soft-footed, uncertain, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But Thorne noticed. The frost melted quicker on the windowsill. The pines stopped groaning in the wind. Birds returned, not many, but enough that their songs became part of the morning. Even the mule, old and creaky, stood straighter in the pasture. Inside the cabin, Maribel moved with quiet assurance. She wore her hair down now, let it fall across her shoulders, like she no longer needed to hide what the world once tried to bruise. She baked without apology, laughed when the dough stuck to her palms, and didn't flinch when Thorne walked close behind her. There was no grand moment, no declaration, just little things that began to stay. One morning she found a folded cloth on the porch. Inside was a small handmade wooden comb. He didn't say it was for her, but she used it anyway. That night, as they sat watching dusk fold into the valley, Maribel whispered, "You never asked me what my real name is." He looked over, gentle and steady. "Didn't think you owed it to me." She nodded once, then said it anyway. And he smiled, just barely, just enough. There was still sorrow between them, still nights where sleep didn't come easy and memories clung like wood smoke. But there was also stew shared without silence, a repaired fence that never leaned again, 2 cups on the table instead of one. And on Sundays, Maribel sang never for an audience, just for the house, as if to remind it that warmth could live here again. The wind changed one evening, not cold this time, but with a scent of pine and earth, like something waking up. And when Thorn reached across the porch rail to hand her a mug of tea, his hand brushed hers. Neither of them pulled away. They didn't name it love. They didn't have to. In the quiet that settled after the last snowmelt, the cabin of Thorn and Leon stood not just as shelter, but as a kind of vow hand-built, weather-worn, and deeply chosen. There was no grand declaration, no need for one. Only the sound of tea poured into a second cup, the sight of a coat draped gently over another's shoulders. The way his name, once buried in silence, was now spoken gently by someone who meant it. They hadn't healed everything. Some grief still rose with the morning frost, but they had made space. And in that space, kindness had taken root, soft as moss, steady as breath. Maybe that's what stories like these remind us, that we don't always need to rescue or be rescued. Sometimes we just need to be seen, named, held in a place where silence is no longer punishment, but peace. Thank you for walking with us through this journey. If this story stirred something in you or reminded you of a time you found light in unexpected places, we'd love to hear it. Leave us a comment. Have you ever been surprised by a second chance or seen someone choose gentleness when the world offered none? Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. For more stories like this, quiet, redemptive, and full of late-blooming hope, share it with someone who still believes in slow love and open doors. And tell us, would you like to see what happens next for Thorn and Leon? Or are there other forgotten corners of the West you'd like us to explore? We're listening.